kind of didn't. With all the other characters, Wonder Woman, so on and so forth, even Superman himself, it was, this is the reboot, this is how it all started, that kind of thing. Batman got that to a degree with regards to Batman Zero Year. The problem with this was the DC was kind of murky on it because people loved the pre-New 52 Batman, and so when the question was asked, is this New 52 Batman or is it pre-New 52 Batman, DC was kind of like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. They were kind of going back and forth, and that of course was back right when the New 52 kicked off, just because of the fact that DC wanted to keep those fans engaged in the Batman line of stories. Now, that answer didn't really matter anyway, just because of the fact that Scott Snyder's storytelling was so incredibly good, along with Greg Capullo's art, that like Court of Owls, Night of Owls, Endgame, Death of the Family, all that kind of stuff, it just gave us some of the best Batman storytelling there's ever been in the history of his character's publications. But the idea here is that what Dan Jurgens does is he essentially tells us through the eyes of Superman that this pre-New 52 Superman is the only pre-New 52 character in the New 52. Wally West, just by virtue of that, the meeting they had when they both raced, Superman saying, you're different from the Wally West that I knew. The fact that Wally West didn't recognize Superman, so they just, it's basically the New 52 red-haired Wally West. The fact that in this particular story, when he begins to, or really when it opens up, he's talking to Lois Lane about how this Batman is not the Batman that he knew. He's younger, he's more inexperienced, or really doesn't have the same experience, different things like that. So this is in effect the New 52 Batman. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is just because of the fact that with this story serving the purpose of giving us this pre-New 52 Superman who was thrust into the New 52 universe, I wanted to kind of use it as a catch-all to sort of grab some of these things that have kind of been lingering here on my channel in terms of answers that people were looking for, and just sort of bring those, give those to people. So that's really where we stand. As far as I'm aware, right now in DC Comics, Superman that's running around is the only pre-New 52 character. Everybody else is New 52. I mean, there's pre-New 52 Lois Lane and pre-New 52 Jonathan Kent, more or less, but the fact remains here that, those are the only pre-New 52 characters. The superheroes that you think of are all New 52. Now, again, that will likely change once we get to like the whole Dr. Manhattan, the Watchmen thing, all that kind of good stuff. That will probably change, or DC may come back and just change that later on. Who knows? Just by answering a question, doing a story. That's the great thing about comics, is that they all just kind of go in circles. They're very cyclical. But with regards to what it is that happens in this story, this is very Dan Jurgens-like. Again, this is simply a scenario where the pre-New 52 Superman is watching things unfold. He's watching Batman engage, in a conflict with the League of Assassins. Now, the funny thing about this is that Superman actually saves Batman's life from an arrow that would have otherwise killed him. Now, of course, Superman using his heat vision keeps Batman alive, but the idea here is that what Lois basically says is you need a friend besides me. You need somebody here that you can confide in. Now, this is Dan Jurgens really just kind of, hearkening back to the Batman Superman line of stories that we saw, before the New 52, because anybody who was reading Batman or Superman in DC before, New 52 started, they'll tell you that Batman and Superman were two peas in a pod. They were, they went together like peas and carrots. They were like the 1-2 punch of comic books, and they still are. I mean, they're still like the top two superheroes in comic books, and they always will be. And that's one of the reasons why their stories and their history has kind of been so tumultuous, especially after reboots, is because of the fact that they always end up getting along later on down the line, just out of sheer respect for one another. But this is also Lois Lane saying, look, this is not the Batman that you know, but it's the only Batman that we have. You need to make friends with this guy, even if it's not like the friendship that you had with the Batman before all this, reboot nonsense started. You need to make friends with him. You guys need to come together, and actually have each other as people you can confide in. Now, this is also Dan Jurgens setting the stage for Francis Manipoul's Trinity. And that's the cool thing. Now, I have no idea whether or not Francis Manipoul and Dan Jurgens even had any measure of a conversation. But even if they never talked, even if they never consulted one another, it's a very organic transition that we have Lois Lane basically saying, hey, look, you and Batman need to become friends, just like you and Wonder Woman need to become friends. You're the Trinity. In the universe we came from, it was you, Batman, and Wonder Woman who were the heroes above all others. It's setting the stage for the whole Trinity story, which is one of the reasons why I love that story so much, is because it's a return to familiarity. But again, much of this, or at least this first little tidbit's also taking place in the past. And the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, this is shortly after Superman's arrival. And so after he had shown up here and the Justice League was more or less formed, it was looking at the different heroes who existed, looking at this New 52 version of Superman, looking at this New 52 version of the Flash, Batman, Wonder Woman, so on and so forth, and understanding where they were coming from and what their motivations were. Because remember, they are not pre-New 52 characters as we know them. And the New 52, they were designed to be less experienced. They were designed to still be coming into their own in terms of what it meant to be a superhero on Earth, and they were designed to still be in the process of gaining the trust of humanity. And so with a more experienced Superman showing up on the scene, it was, wow, this is totally different. Let's see what these guys are about. Now, jumping back to the present, we basically pick up where the last video left off, with this new villain Blank that we don't know anything about, attacking Superman and then just burying him under a mountain. Now, at this point, the efforts of Blank and Hank Henshaw, who's been taken over, by Blank, basically transitions to the idea of escape. Just because, remember, with Blank himself, he doesn't know where they are. He has no idea what the Fortress of Solitude is. All he knows is that he's just been kept prisoner for the last several years, and he's trying to break his way free. Now, of course, with the arrival of Superman himself and the two of them fighting with one another, this is Dan Jurgens reminding us that Blank's powers come in the form of telepathy and telekinesis. Hence the reason Blank's able to bend Hank Henshaw to his will, but also the idea that Blank's able to go toe-to-toe with Superman, because remember, Superman is only as strong as the environment around him. And so if somebody with telekinesis were able to manipulate the air around them or something like that to basically turn it into an indestructible wall, then it'll look like Superman is punching dead air and can't break through. So that's one of the cool things that really goes on here. But the fact remains that what ends up happening is that in the midst of all this, Blank sort of begins to relinquish his control slightly on Henshaw, simply because of the fact that with, Blank totally dominating Henshaw's mind, he's basically hindering Henshaw's ability to access one of these ships and allow the two of them to get away. But in this moment of relinquishing his complete and total control, Henshaw takes the opportunity to basically take Blank by surprise, shooting him with an energy beam, and then he's promptly thrown in a prison cell and basically kept there. Now, this is one of the reasons why Dan Jurgens, at least in this story, is very much rooted in 1990s Superman. In 90s Superman, his stories were everywhere. I mean, there were a lot of instances where characters were just introduced for the purpose of a story, and then they were never seen or heard from again. They would just vanish out of thin air. With this, it's not like these characters vanish, they will come back, but we're given people, who are basically just kind of here, like, Dratanya, for example, Klon. A couple of these individuals, we don't know anything about them, for whatever reason. If Dratanya were to step out of the cell that she's in, she would basically die. With Klon, we don't even know what his deal is. I mean, it seems like if he were to step out of that, he would die as well. So we don't know if they're displaced in time. We don't know if they're not native to this universe, and if they were to step out, they would cease to exist. We don't know if the oxygen is toxic to them. We have no idea what their whole situation is. The issue here is this may or may not be something that Dan Jurgens will flesh out later on down the line. And that was kind of the issue, is Dan Jurgens would give us these little throwaway moments, and we would be interested to see what happens next, but we would never find out because he would just never expand on it, or he might forget about it or something like that. And so that's kind of the issues, is that it's so many threads being pulled in from so many different directions that it can kind of make the stories a little bit baffling. In truth, that's one of the reasons why I think that the way Jurgens is doing Superman, in DC Rebirth proper is so well, is because they're basically linear stories. It's this event happens, and then that event happens, and then that event happens. And instead of taking all of those events and putting them into a single 6-issue story arc, they're spread over the course of, 3 6-issue story arcs, or 3 6-issue story arcs, and then 2 3-issue story arcs, or something like that. They're spread out over the course of the publication, and it works out in a way that tells a cohesive story that's easy to follow. And so that's why, a lot of what's going on in Superman right now is so cool. Now, we pick up with one of these instances where, Jurgens just kind of grabs a plot out of nowhere, when we basically pick up with a guy by the name of Bradley Glenn. Now, Bradley Glenn is a guy who's recently been released from prison. We don't know what he did, but he's met with a woman named Trish Riddick, and Trish Riddick is basically somebody running a reality TV show. And what they want to do is they want to put him in a show where he's going to, essentially tear apart a building. Now, the idea here is that this bridge is going to be destroyed anyway, but the idea is to basically show, how crazy villains could be, just some nonsense stuff. And so this is kind of setting the stage for that, but we switch back over to Superman and to Hank Henshaw. Now, again, these are a couple of these plot threads coming too, but with regards to Henshaw, keep in mind, in the pre-New 52 universe, Hank Henshaw was Cyborg Superman. And so when pre-New 52 Superman sees a guy named Hank Henshaw, his first thought is, oh my God, he's going to become Cyborg Superman. And that was the whole basis of the encounter between the two. When Hank Henshaw's shuttle crashed down to Earth, Superman went to go figure out what was going on. He discovered Hank Henshaw as the sole survivor of the vessel, just like, his pre-New 52 counterpart. Superman's thought was, okay, let's take him to the Fortress of Solitude, or let's take him to my base of operations in the Himalayas. Let's analyze him and make sure that he's not basically going to become the guy that I know as Cyborg Superman. Now, of course, what this also does is it leads Superman to realize that this Hank Henshaw is not like the one that he knew before the New 52. And so because of this, Dan Jurgens kind of toys with this idea that this Henshaw might become Cyborg Superman, or he may just be an average human that we'll never see beyond this story. Now, we know just by virtue of DC Rebirth, the Action Comics Superman stories, that Hank Henshaw is going to become Cyborg Superman, or that Cyborg Superman is going to return. Whether it'll be Hank Henshaw, we don't know, but I have a hard time believing that it wouldn't be. But the fact remains here that we also find out that the energy blast that was used to subdue Blank in order for Superman to throw him into a prison cell actually came from an object called the Oblivion Stone. Now, at this point, we switch over to a bounty hunter. And again, that's why I say there's all these little plot threads kind of coming in and sort of coalescing into one location. This bounty hunter, or at least this woman who's essentially a hunter, is traversing the landscape looking for the Oblivion Stone. Having located it on Earth, that's where her journey brings her. And the idea is to grab her armor, show up on Earth, take the Oblivion Stone, which we know is going to lead into a confrontation between her and Superman. And so what happens is we basically transition over to the revelation that this again coincides during the events of Superman Truth, which is when the New 52 Lois Lane dumped the New 52 Superman's identity as Clark Kent out into the world. And so again, what this does is it basically makes things really, really difficult for the pre-New 52 Lois Lane and the pre-New 52 Superman. And the reason why is because if the pre-New 52 Superman shaves his beard, he'll look like an older version of the New 52 Superman, which means they can't use the identities of Clark Kent and Lois Lane. Now, up until this point, they've been using the identities of Lois White, I think it is, and Clark White, kind of a combination of Lois Lane, Clark Kent, and Perry White, just because of the fact that Perry was such an intrinsic part of their lives. But what this also does is it shows us that Lois Lane's friend, Cora Bennett, had basically been taken by Intergang. Now, again, that's why I say there's a lot of little plot threads going on here. Now, Intergang, again, is very much a Lois Lane aspect of this story in the sense that it would be nothing for Superman to take out Intergang, and so there wouldn't really be a reason for him to face off against them. Instead, what it does is it adds a little bit of dynamic growth to Lois Lane herself, and that was kind of the important thing, is because remember, a lot of people who only knew the New 52 Lois Lane picked up this story, and they were being exposed to the pre-New 52 Lois Lane. And so because they never read anything before the New 52, they didn't know the kind of tenacity that Lois Lane had before the New 52. They didn't know how far to the lengths she was willing to go in order to get the right story published. They didn't really know the moral compass of the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, when the pre-New 52 Lois Lane would not dump the identities of like Hal Jordan or Batman or anybody like that, regardless of the story. It would take something like an Injustice level event, which is to say them becoming legitimate bad guys, in order for her to dump their personalities out there, just because of the fact that she would know the ramifications for that would be extreme, because it wouldn't just be the superheroes who would be in danger, it would be their friends, it would be their family. She understood the gravity of consequences. And so what ends up happening here is Superman basically takes off to the skies of Metropolis. Lois Lane calls the cell phone of Cora, Superman picks it up, races over, and then saves her from Intergang. And that's really about it. I mean, it's just a small little tidbit kind of being wrapped up. Now we'll see them, here a little bit more in a second, but what we end up doing is we switch back over to this bridge, this reality TV show. And of course, the situation goes as awry as we would expect it to, in the sense that with this bridge being demolished, that this guy just starts crushing everything. The problem with this is that while this bridge was supposed to be demolished, people didn't know. And so people were traveling along this bridge. And so what ends up happening is that when Superman races by, when Intergang basically grabs Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent, whisks them away from the school in order to hold them prisoner, Superman races to go find Lois Lane, only to run up on this guy who's tearing apart a bridge, putting, innocent people's lives in danger. And so again, it's really just kind of a mistaken circumstance, but that's why I say that, some of this stuff isn't really necessary, because Dan Jurgens writes Superman, or really wrote Superman in the 90s, to basically say, hey, look, here's Superman as you know him, the things he struggles with, but here's like 50 other things that he has to deal with along the way. It's not necessary. It's interesting, but it's not necessary. It's really just kind of expanding a story just for the sake of having it expanded. Now, I don't say that to indicate that Dan Jurgens is a terrible writer, not by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we know right now, just from DC Rebirth, that Dan Jurgens is incredible at the stuff that he does. That's one of the reasons why, if you watch my videos on Superman, I'll tell you, Superman is the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth right now, just because it's just so incredibly well written. So, Dan Jurgens knows what he's doing. I would surmise that with regards to this story, Jurgens probably meant for it to be more along like 12 issues or something like that, but it had to be condensed down to 9. Now, that may have been editorial control. At this point, I'm just kind of speculating, but I base that off the idea that you have to remember, when DC Rebirth was kicking off, and DC basically said, hey, look, DC Rebirth is going to start on this date. And so all the stories that are going on have to be wrapped up. Batman being the god of knowledge has to be wrapped up. The New 52 Superman being the god of strength has to be wrapped up. Shazam, Hal Jordan, The Flash, Wonder Woman, all those little storylines have to be wrapped up and done by the time DC Rebirth starts. And so this one was just kind of thrown in there, and again, it's really fun, but it was likely just the idea of time constraints that put it where it is. But the fact remains here, switching back over to Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent, the cool thing here is that with regards to them being in danger, this really hits home at the idea that Lois Lane will always be saved by Superman. I mean, we mentioned that in the last video about how Superman would do anything to save Lois Lane, even if it meant innocent people dying. I mean, you know, if you go back and you look at like the old 1940s Golden Age comic books, there's times there was an instance where Superman let a guy drive off a cliff and die because one, he thought the guy was a criminal and was like, hey, look, man, he got what was coming to him. And two, he was going to save the life of somebody. You know, he was like, hey, man, that guy's a bad guy. That's just the way it goes. You know, there were instances where he would let innocent people fall to their fate because he was going to save Lois Lane. Now, at the time, it was just the writing, you know, in the sense of, well, will Superman save Lois Lane? But that was the craziness of those Golden Age 1940s, early 1950s comics, is that Superman had a little moral ambiguity. You know, there were times where innocent people would be killed because he was going to save Lois Lane. Now, it wasn't like he was going, like he killed them himself. It's not like he was like, oh my God, man, you know, this guy, I'm taking him to the hospital. Well, I'm just going to kill him so I don't have to worry about taking him to the hospital. And then I'm going to go save Lois Lane. It wasn't like that. It was really more of like inaction that would lead to those individuals being killed. But it was kind of funny because I was looking through the comments and they were like, no, Superman would not let innocent people die in order to save Lois Lane. Oh, yes, he did. He did that quite a bit. If you go back and look at those old comics, he did that on more than a few times. But the fact remains here that again, this really kind of hits home at that little situation there in the sense that where Superman's basically dealing with the idea of this negligent producer, you know, / director tearing this bridge up, that once it's all said and done, you know, he basically grabs a guy, says, look, all right, this is ridiculous, clears the situation up, chastises the woman, which in truth, it probably wouldn't have hurt to throw her into the sun, you know, and then he races off to save Lois Lane. Now, of course, the funny thing here is that in the midst of this, it's actually him showing up after Lois Lane and Jonathan are saved. And the reason why is because it's Jonathan that saves them. And that's one of the coolest things about this, is because Jonathan Kent as a character is one of the most interesting in the realm of DC Rebirth. You know, he's one of the coolest things that's out there, to see his character grow, to see him expand. When he's in this chair, he basically just kind of like rips himself free. He just snaps out of the chair, frees himself, you know, and all of this is rooted in the fact that he's lashing out to a degree at his mom. Now, it's not him being violent. It's not him just being like, I'm going to kill you if you don't tell me the truth. It's him basically saying, I want to know who I am. I want to know what I'm about. Now, the reason why is because Jonathan had been doing his own investigations. When the New 52 Lois Lane outed the identity of the New 52 Superman, Jonathan basically saw that the New 52 Superman was named Clark Kent. Well, he's not unintelligent. And in his mind, it couldn't have been a coincidence that his father was just racing off all the time to do things and so on and so forth. And his father's name was Clark and his mother's name was Lois. It couldn't have been a coincidence. Even if they weren't the exact same people, that there was something going on, that his father had powers or something along those lines, and so did he. And so again, it was him basically just kind of asking the question, who am I? What am I about? Now, of course, in the midst of this, with the place with the, you know, where they're being held captive, with the whole thing burning down, Jonathan actually reaches out and grabs the door handle without any injury whatsoever and opens it, freeing his mother and himself. And so in terms of Jonathan Kent's chronology in DC Comics, this is the first time his powers manifest. This is the first time he shows any display that he inherited his father's ability. Now, that's one of the reasons why I love this, is because despite the fact that we know that that was going to be the case, we knew that as soon as Jonathan Kent showed up, as soon as Lois Lane turned out to be pregnant, we knew that Jonathan was going to have Superman's powers. We knew that if Lois Lane ever became pregnant, if Lois and Superman ever produced a son, their kid was going to have superpowers. We just knew that. I mean, I doubt there was anybody out there who was like, I mean, I don't know, man, maybe they'll have a kid and it'll just be a regular human being. No, because that wouldn't be cool. Like, it's we knew he was going to have powers. But despite knowing that, him reaching out to this door handle, opening it up and freeing himself and his mom is no less impactful. And that's why I say it's so cool the way this is done, is because it emphasizes the idea that writing can really make comics stand out. Between the writing and the art, it really creates comics, you know, turns them into something that's so cool, is because we know what will happen. Like, we know, for example, that Superman's going to save Lois Lane. We know Lois Lane, we know she's going to live. But it doesn't mean that we're not sitting on the edge of our seats. Oh my God, will Superman save her? Like, you know, it doesn't It doesn't mean that we're not doing that. We're just as curious to see if Superman will actually make it. Will he make it there in the nick of time? But I think that what this moment does, and the reason why it's so cool, is because it shifts the focus away from Superman. Because now it's like, oh my God, Jonathan saved his mom and himself. Well, what's Jonathan gonna do next? Like, I wonder what kind of powers is he gonna have? And so now it's Dan Jurgens kind of shifting the focus, because it's Jurgens basically saying, look guys, this is Superman, right? Like, you know what Superman can do. His strength is varied from one generation to the next, but you know what Superman is about. Our question is Jonathan. He's young, he's new, he's a freshly introduced character to the realm of DC Comics. What kind of future lies waiting for him? That's where a lot of, or at least a lot of my interest is. I don't know about you guys, you know, that's where a lot of my interest is, you know. But with switching back over to you know, this bounty hunter woman named Hyathis, again, she's basically just tracking down this Oblivion Stone. And this is where we learn that this stone, you know, with regards to this trip that Hank Henshaw and his wife and the various scientists had gone on, that they had basically found this stone, and he used this stone to manipulate and to give himself some measure of powers. Now, it was really him just using the stone more so than him imbuing himself with legit abilities. But the fact remains that after rescuing Lois and Jonathan, and after being told, hey, look, Jonathan was the one that saved us, you know, Soups. Jonathan is the one that basically saved our lives. You know, he has your powers. The discussion of what Jonathan's capable of who Jonathan is going to become, that's put on hold. Now, the beauty of that is you can literally segue from this story, from Superman, Lois, and Clark, and jump right into Superman Rebirth and Action Comics Rebirth, and it's a seamless story because it goes right into, you know, Superman teaching his son about how to be a superhero, how to use his powers, why he wore the costume that he wore for so long, why he's wearing black now, why he's wearing the blue and yellow and red in the DC Rebirth stories, you know, why he has his quote-unquote underwear on the outside, why he does those things, because it's basically teaching his son what it means to be a hero. Now, the other cool thing here is we end up finding out that this Oblivion Stone, as it's possessed by Hank Henshaw, is only one half of the stone, that the other half is residing somewhere, which of course we end up finding out is in the Fortress of Solitude. And so what Dan Jurgens does is he wraps this up pretty fast. And that's one of the other benefits about Jurgens, is he wraps things up and, you know, quick, fast, and in a hurry. But the other half of this is he begins setting the stage for the exploration of Jonathan Kent's character, because I think we can all kind of agree that with regards to the Superman stories, even, you know, between both Superman and Action Comics, Jonathan Kent is largely the star of the comic. Superman is a huge focal point, but my interest has always been in Jonathan. And the things that Superman does are designed to relate to Jonathan in terms of how to become a superhero, what to do with his powers, and what it means to have that kind of power. And so the cool thing is that we initially see Jonathan trying to learn how to fly. And he's like jumping off the stairs and stuff like that. He's trying to figure out how to use his ability to fly. Now, this is really cool because what this does is it kind of makes it visceral, right? It makes it more real, because it's not like we try to, you know, experience the idea of having powers, but it's like trying to learn how to write with your left hand, right? You know, or it's trying to learn how to touch your head and rub your belly at the same time. You know, it's trying to learn how to ride a bike. It's trying to learn how to do something that you know you can do. It's just, why can't you do it? And that's the cool thing, you know, with regards to Jonathan, is because by virtue of his father, the fact that he touched the door, he was able to open it even when it was on fire. You know, he was able to demonstrate super strength, durability, things like that. The question is, if his father can do all these things and his father can fly, surely he can fly. So if he can fly, then why hasn't he flown? And so again, it's really, really cool to kind of see this happen, to see this little bit of an explanation take place. But again, at this point, it's really just kind of Superman going against Hyathis and the two of them fighting and realizing that she's after the piece of the Oblivion Stone that's sitting in the Fortress of Solitude. But again, it's Dan Jurgens basically setting the stage for her return later on down the line, because the conflict is pretty straightforward in the sense that we actually have Officer Chambers, you know, of the US government, showing up on the scene because he's simply been tracking down Superman. Remember, when Superman first showed up in the New 52 universe, he was operating underground behind the scenes, and Chambers was just a guy trying to figure out who this man was. Who's this man that's saving trains that are going to crash into one another? Who's this man that's basically, you know, taking out these weird villains and so on and so forth that the New 52 Superman simply wouldn't have time for or didn't know about? Who was this hidden hand operating behind the scenes? That was really the extent of Chambers' involvement within this story. And so with conflict between herself and Superman finally coming to an end, she more or less gives up on trying to get to the Fortress of Solitude and says, you know, well, I'll be back one day. And that's pretty much the end of her. I mean, you know, she'll probably come back somewhere along the line. But with regards to this, it really just kind of wraps up quick in the sense that Chambers is just kind of left as a guy who wants answers. Now, that seems to be kind of a throwaway moment. On the surface, it seems like Dan Jurgens is just kind of throwing it away, but he's not. He's actually doing something really awesome here. with Chambers basically being left with no answers, it actually makes it very realistic. It makes it very real, because what it does is it offers a comparison between Superman and a normal person. You know, Superman is a person who exists beyond the realm of authority. If the US government wanted to take out Superman, well, best of luck to you. Unless you've got kryptonite, you're probably going to be out of luck. This is the New 52 universe, so that even then, it begs the question, would kryptonite from this universe work on that Superman? You know, there's a lot of questions that kind of have to be answered here. Now, I don't know what direction DC is going to go with that, but for the most part, the governments of the world are powerless in the face of someone with the kind of abilities that Superman has. And that's really what's being displayed here. And that's one of the reasons why the pre-New 52 Superman was such a great character, is because he wouldn't make these grandiose displays of his power by like destroying the governments of the world or anything like that. I mean, it would be cool against villains, but the more significant displays of his power is when a normal human says, hey, look, I want answers from you. I'm used to getting answers from people. And Superman's like, not today. And he just leaves, and Chambers is powerless to do anything to stop him. That's the cool comparison. That's the cool expansion of Superman's powers, is showing us what he can do. Chambers can't do anything. What's he gonna do? Shoot him? I mean, okay. And Superman will just keep on flying and you won't even realize that it happened. So again, it's kind of a cool comparison here. But at the end of the day, we kind of jump back over to Jonathan and to Superman and to Lois. And this is when Superman begins the process of taking Jonathan under his wing. And what he does is he actually takes him into the woodshed and shows him the clothing that Superman wore when he first arrived on Earth, the outfit with the big red S, you know, and he gives it to Jonathan. And Jonathan, using that cape, begins to fly, you know, and it's basically when his father tells him, if you want it to happen, all you have to do is believe in yourself.